Hello and welcome to Fostering Success Michigan's Network webinar series. I am Carrie Ward and I am Director of Fostering Success Michigan. Fostering Success Michigan is a statewide initiative that aims to increase access and success in higher education and post-college careers for students with experience in foster care. We're super happy to have you here today. Today, the webinar will focus on education in foster care, stability for students. It's the law. As I said, I'm Carrie Ward, Director of Fostering Success Michigan. Before we get started, I would just like to thank our host organization, the New Foster Care, for supporting all of the work of FSM. Housekeeping. So all attendees are in listen-only mode, but you may utilize the chat or the questions feature on the control panel to the right to ask any questions that you may have. We are going to have a question and answer segment at the very end of the webinar, so know that. This webinar will be recorded and available on the FSM website following the broadcast. We do have a rather full house today. Lots of people are joining us live. So, and I know sometimes GoToWebinar struggles a little bit with tech when there's a lot of people. So if you are dropped or you have sound issues, just know that the recording in its entirety will be available later today on the FSM website. Documents are available on the control panel to the right. GoToWebinar allows us to upload 5 handouts, so there are 5 included there. There are additional resources and handouts that are available on our ESSA toolkit on the FSM website at the link that you see there. And the PowerPoint will also be available following the webinar. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Kathleen Haney, Foster Care Consultant, Office of Educational Supports for the Michigan Department of Education. And I would like to introduce Ann Rossi, who is Education Analyst, Education Youth Services for the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. Thank you so much, ladies, for joining us.
Good afternoon, and we do appreciate your patience as we work through some of the tech, let's call them situations. We won't call them issues. This is our first time actually presenting a webinar from this particular location at MDE, and we're all kind of working to learn the system. You may notice that if you have seen presentations that Ann Rossi and I have done previous to this one, we have added a few new points of discussion, and we will be talking in detail about those. First off, we'll talk about the Children's Protective Services and Family Team Meetings. Ann will also cover the Fostering Connections Act of 2008. I will go through the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015 and how that connects broadly and universally over HHS, Health and Human Services, and the U.S. Department of Ed that trickles down to the state and local level. We'll talk about education best interest determination. We'll talk about point of contact and district liaison responsibilities. We'll discuss transportation collaboration at the local level. And at the end of the presentation, there are some updates. And as Carrie mentioned, if for some reason we had our time blocked from 12 to 1, it is likely that our presentation may be just a bit longer. If you have to leave, we just want you to feel confident knowing that this presentation will be available in full, posted on the FSM site, and MDE Foster Care webpage will have a link directly to that site. So if you have to leave for another important meeting, feel confident that we will share all of this information with you.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. As Carrie said, my name is Ann Rossi. I'm with the Department of Health and Human Services. I'm the Education Analyst for the Education and Youth Services Unit. So I'm kind of Kathleen's counterpart on the child welfare side. So welcome, and we're so happy to have you here so that we can talk about how to better serve our students in the education system as they go through the foster care system. So one thing we wanted to start with this time As Kathleen and I have been across the state the last almost 2 years, doing different trainings to both child welfare staff and education staff, I think one thing that always hits me is that we still really talk different languages. There's education language, there's child welfare languages, but even more than that, we don't always understand each other's roles and maybe the system. As I know, as a child welfare worker, as a foster care worker, I did not always understand the roles of people in the school system or how things worked. And I think it goes the other way too. I think sometimes schools don't always understand kind of how that works from within the foster care system. So that's why we're starting these first couple slides here about CPS and FTM. So here on this first slide, Children's Protective Services, or CPS, as most people are listening are probably mandated reporters. I'm sure you know that what CPS does. They investigate allegations of suspected child abuse or neglect. In Michigan, we now have a centralized intake, so anywhere in the state that you call regarding suspected abuse or neglect, you're getting one location. They are then filtering that out, either filtering it out to close and not do anything further, or filtering it out to a CPS investigator within the county the family lives, so within then that DHS office. They then do an investigation, and based on their investigation, interviews with the family, with the child, with possibly school personnel, and other assessments, an outcome comes from that. And so I have listed here what most of those outcomes would be. So in some cases, there's no preponderance of evidence is found, and the case is going to be closed. So the allegations were either found to be false or not enough for further services to be recommended. It's just closed at that point. No more services, no more contact with CPS necessary. It could be that in-home services may be either offered or required. In some cases, they may be offered just as resources. Here is a parenting class, here's some substance abuse resources for you, some housing resources for you, but nothing else is further done, or they may be required. And in some of those cases, that CPS case may stay open during those services. So a CPS case may stay open while a parent receives parenting classes or something like that, see if the risk goes away, and then close it out. Children may be removed and placed in foster care, and I think that's why we're all here. Children are placed either with a licensed foster home, an unlicensed relative, or sometimes a residential facility. So they're coming into care, they're removed by the court order and placed in foster care. In other cases, children may be placed with relatives, and no foster care case may be open, and this would include a non-offending parent. This often gets confused when people think that a child is in foster care. They may even have a foster care worker, but they're placed with the other parent. Maybe siblings came into care, one child went with their non-offending parent, and so that's not counted as foster care. And when we talk about transportation later, DHHS would not pay for transportation for education when a child is placed with either biological parent. If when initially placed in foster care, the distance to the school of origin is too great, enrollment in a new school may occur immediately without a formal best interest discussion. We often hear that schools are not being involved in those discussions. We just always want you to understand that oftentimes these CPS workers are removing children on weekends in the middle of the night, and we're also always looking at a few things first. So we always want to keep siblings together, and we often don't have foster homes that can take maybe a sibling group of 3 or 4 children. So in those types of cases, the children are going to be enrolled in the new school immediately, possibly without that discussion. They should then be getting in touch with you once that gets to foster care. But those are the times from that CPS and that initial removal that sometimes the school isn't going to be able to be notified prior to actual enrollment. The other case would be finding relatives that are in a different part of the state, and we are always going to place with relatives first. I wanted to talk a little bit about family team meetings. And so this is what we in our child welfare world within DHHS call, this is our case conference. But it's a much more structured approach to involving youth, families, and caregivers in case planning as a case goes from the CPS process into the foster care process, and then possibly to either reunification or adoption after that. So it's a facilitated meeting of the family and their identified supports. Families should be able to include or disinclude people that they want in that meeting. So a foster care worker may say, we think somebody should be invited, and the parent can say they don't want them there, but they should also be able to include people that they do want and that they feel are supports. I listed here what points of the case an FTM is mandated to occur, and initial placement is one. So this may not end up happening until actual removal, after actual removal of the children. Like I said, if it happens at an odd time on the weekend, there may not be time to have an FTM scheduled prior to removal, but there would be an FTM as soon as possible after that. And when possible, we would want to have the FTM prior to that initial placement. Permanency goal review and permanency goal change. So this is after children are in care for 6 months. We are looking at, are we still working towards reunification as a goal, or are we looking at termination of parental rights and going to move towards adoption? So whenever we're reviewing that goal, we have to have an FTM at that point too. Any placement, preservation, disruption, or change. So if we are looking at changing a child's home placement, foster parents have decided they want the children to move, we have to have an FTM at that point. This at a semi-annual transition FTM, this is for twice a year for youth age 14 and older. A 90-day discharge, this is for our youth that are leaving care at age 16 or older, so 90 days prior to leaving, they should have an FTM. And those two, the semi-annual and 90-day, are really specific FTMs and have very specific pieces of those to make sure that our youth that are leaving care without the permanency of adoption are getting services, resources, and permanency relationships in their lives as they leave care. Case closure, and then anytime, at any point in the case, a family can recommend an FTM. So although it is not specified within CPS, so going back to the CPS investigation, they're investigating, they're deciding to remove, they're getting a court order to remove children and place them in foster care. It's not required that education be involved in that initial removal FTM. It's a very overwhelming time. You are doing a lot to get into court, get the children removed, get the children placed, and then eventually transfer over to a foster care caseworker. So it's a very busy time, but we have put out to the field in several different ways to our child welfare staff that best practice is to include school staff at those initial placement FTMs. For a replacement FTM, it would be easier because that is more of policy for foster care workers to include education staff. But we do say that best practice, when possible, to invite them at that initial FTM as well. Even if you can be included by phone, even if you can't be there at all, we know that there's really important information that you as the school staff would be able to provide prior to the meeting, as you would know what services they're getting in the school setting. Even we've put out there as best practice as considering having that FTM at school, maybe after school or during lunchtime, if that would be a space that you could have that meeting. I did just want to note here, though, that transfer from a CPS worker to foster care and getting the foster care worker actually signed may take up to 5 days. And so that's where that enrollment happens prior to foster care getting involved, because when that case is first coming in, they have that 5 days to transfer over. Again, once you're once a child's in foster care and they're moving from one foster home to another, that's a different story. But that initial transfer within CPS can be a really trying time and not always able to get everybody at the table. And the DHS, we'll talk more about the 942 in a minute, but the DHS 942 is a foster care required form. It's not necessarily the CPS form. It's not going to be the CPS worker that's sending that form to the school. So moving on into Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act of 2008. That is a mouthful. This is more going to be talking about child welfare policy. This Fostering Connections was federal legislation passed now 11 years ago, I guess, and this really started to revamp. There's been more since. Revamp the child welfare system across the country, and really looked at getting permanency for all of our kids quicker, and getting them into permanent situations, and including kind of the permanency and stability of education. So what I have here is out of Fostering Connections, but if you are a child welfare worker, you know that this is within our state policy, FOM 723. And what it says is that all of our case plans include assurances of educational stability. So our caseworkers, foster care caseworkers, again, do a case plan every 90 days. And within that, Fostering Connections now required that we very specifically address what's going on educationally for any child in foster care. Child welfare staff must consider appropriateness of school and proximity to school of origin when making placements. So although we know sometimes these things happen in an emergency situation, we should be considering what this placement means for education. And then it said we really needed to start working with school staff. We needed to get out of our silo of child welfare and foster care and reach out to school staff to look at these best interest determinations. And we'll talk about best interest determinations in a minute. And it said we needed to keep our kids in the school of origin as often as possible. But sometimes we know that, and I mentioned, sometimes we have a sibling group where there's no placement that's going to be close enough to reasonably think that these students can be transported back to their school of origin. So we are going to have to move them. And what Fostering Connections goes on to say that in that case, we must provide immediate and appropriate enrollment in a new school. And what we define that in Michigan within our state policy is within 5 school days. And we do report on that federally as far as our kids being enrolled within the 5 days. And this is regardless of possibly having all the educational records. So sometimes when we have kids come into care, we don't have the birth certificate right away. We don't have immunizations right away. But anything we can do as the foster care staff, helping to provide any educational records to that new school that we may have, if it is a child that's been in care and we have information within our case file, anything we can provide to the school to help that enrollment happen seamlessly. I already mentioned a little bit the notification and records release form. This is the DHS 942. And it is required, and this is within our policy, and it was required of all of our foster care workers to send this 942 to the school to notify, and I have the bullets here of when any of these things occur. When a student first enters care, whether a school move is required or not. This is going to be the foster care worker that does this probably. It's not going to be the CPS worker. So it is going to be after that case has transferred over to foster care. That foster care worker is to send that to the school to say this child is now in foster care. Anytime a student moves foster homes, again, whether there was a school move or not, even to tell that same school that this child is now in this foster home and these are now the foster parents or relative caregivers. Anytime a student transfers school, obviously we want the new school to know that this child is in foster care. When a caseworker is completing their case service plan that I mentioned, this is a records release form as well. So this could be a foster care worker asking a school for the most updated IEP, the most updated grade report, progress report, things like that. And most recently, we're adding in our updated policy coming out for when a case closes. We realized after developing the 942 that oftentimes a school knows a child's in foster care and then they don't realize when a case closes that they've now maybe returned home and there's no foster care left involved. So we have added that this should also now be sent to the school when that foster care case officially closes.
And so in 2015, the Every Student Succeeds Act was signed into law. We call that ESSA. And we know that there was intentional movement at the federal level to include Health and Human Services with US Ed. And so this new federal law was written into the Every Student Succeeds Act to ensure that there was collaboration across the agencies at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local education and local DHS or child welfare placing agency level. And we know that ESSA updated the Elementary and Secondary Act, or ESSA, of 1965. It replaced, it kind of swept away No Child Left Behind. We know it amended the definition, or the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, and removed foster care specifically from that count, which separates the money. And it specifically and intentionally connected education law to DHHS law. There was intention around that. The law was passed in 2015, and there was a year lag between 2015 and 2016 when that law was expected to begin implementation. It does require, for the real first time, that all students should expect to have the same access to high standards of education and support that prepares them to be successful in college and career. It does increase our subgroup reporting populations to include homeless, foster, and students experiencing military life. So we know that we've had data around some of those populations in the past, but now we are required to report it. And what that means is MDE at the state agency will report to US Ed, which we have just done, information and data for foster students, homeless students, and those experiencing military life for the 2017-18 school year. Those reports are published and they are out in the My School Data portal. It does also guarantee that steps are taken to help students and their schools improve. And in Michigan, when a school falls to the bottom 5%, in Michigan, we call that, and this is all approved in our ESSA plan at the federal level, a partnership agreement. So the 3 new subgroups can contribute to a district being identified for those additional supports if their subgroup population meets the N size, which for Michigan is 30. ESSA did amend the McKinney-Vento Assistance Act. It removed the term awaiting foster care placement from that part of the law. And the reason for the year lag was there are states across the nation who had that actual language in their legislation, and they gave generously a year for that to move at the legislative level to remove that particular wording. So at this time, foster youth are not automatically considered homeless under McKinney-Vento. And I will have an opportunity to share this information at a pupil accounting meeting March 18th in Wayne REISA. Because I have data at the state level that shows more than half of the students who were in foster care, identified as in foster care, were also listed as homeless. And we know just from our definitions that that is not the case. We know that there is still confusion, and we're just trying to clarify and catch up and train as much as we are able to be in front of audiences and help folks understand that foster students are not necessarily homeless students. There can be times when they meet both criteria, but it is the exception rather than the rule. So those foster youth cannot receive those McKinney-Vento services based on foster status alone. In Michigan's state title plan, or our ESSA plan, which is approved at the federal level, it says that we must ensure collaboration with the state child welfare agency to ensure that stability of students who are experiencing care. That's what the law says. It's students' rights to have stable educational environments. And I believe that we are working as hard on both sides of this, the DHHS side and the school side, to ensure that for students. It is two very large organizational systems working in partnership and trying to train. So with that said, we are responsible as a state agency to appoint a contact or a point of contact who is different than the McKinney-Vento, who is the identified McKinney-Vento coordinator, which is why they had to create a new position. And it is expected that there will be collaboration with DHHS or the other state agency responsible for administering those state plans under the Fostering Connections Act alongside LEAs. At the local level, every LEA, local education agency, who receives and accepts Title I money has an assurance within the consolidated application that says you will designate a point of contact in the EEM or educational entity master, that you will develop and implement procedures around transportation or how transportation to maintain foster youth in their schools of origin when it's determined to be in their best interest, how that will be provided, arranged, and funded, and develop procedures to maintain foster youth during any type of dispute around transportation funding. In Michigan, and Ann will cover this in a slide going forward, there is legislation that allows DHHS in Michigan to have the final say, but we are, of course, encouraging collaboration around student placement. So for in Michigan, if there's a dispute, it is around transportation funding. So if you are looking for who is listed in the EEM, we have directions. We have also included a handout that, as Carrie mentioned earlier in the beginning, there is a link to a document that explains how to access information. Also on MDE's, it is the Oldfield Services landing webpage, directions on how to add someone to the educational entity master. If you need that information to be refreshed, please contact me. I'm so happy to help make sure that the people in your district understand how to make sure the right people are in the right spaces so that they can be contacted. The EEM is the only mechanism that MDE has to communicate and contact those foster liaisons. Often I'm contacted by people asking to be put on the listserv. The only listserv that I have comes directly from the EEM. So if you're not in the EEM, ask to be in the EEM because there's no other way for me to generate that listserv.
Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about best interest factors. We've mentioned it a few times here and there, so we just wanted to give you a little more details on it. And I think one of the handouts is a best interest checklist. If it's not in the handouts with the webinar, I know it's in the on the toolkit. One thing I want to go back and mention, though, because I don't think we have, is when we are talking about best interest factors and making that decision, we are only talking about the school district of origin or the school district of residence. And this is a big thing that comes up, I think, with child welfare staff, with foster care staff, not understanding that those are the two choices. Now, if a foster parent or a biological parent decides on a third school that they want their child to go to, they have a right to apply for that if school of choice is an option. But as far as the rights under foster care, Fostering Connections and ESSA and the transportation, we're only looking at those two districts, the school of origin or the school of residence. So listed here are the different things that we encourage, that we tell our foster care workers they need to be considering when looking at the school of origin or the school of residence. And parents or guardians need to be involved. If rights have not been terminated to biological parents and they're temporary court orders, then biological parents should be involved. They're involved in case planning, so they should be included in these decisions. And then guardians, caregivers should also have a right to these discussions as well. Educational input from school staff and specifically the school district liaisons. We so encourage our foster care workers to make sure that these discussions are being had whenever possible, whenever there's that time ahead of a move, that we know that school staff have so much input and history sometimes with the kids that are now in foster care. Looking at the social emotional state, academic achievement, looking at how many credits they have, especially our high school students that have moved a lot and are lagging way behind in academic credits. So considering that. Continuity of relationships, so this could be teachers, but also friends and other people that they are close to in their school building. Special education programming, extracurricular activities. We encourage our youth to participate in these in extracurricular activities, and so it may be, you know, for high school kids, it may be the only thing that's keeping a kid going to school. So that, you know, and if they switch schools, they're in the middle of the sport and now they can't join or whatever. Distance and travel time to the current school. Now, this isn't cost. We'll talk about payment. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it can be too far to feasibly think of a child being in a taxi, on a bus. It may be too far, but we can't, this is not counting cost. Supportive relationships, and then length of anticipated stay and placement. Sometimes we are expecting this to be a short-term placement while mom is getting some kind of service, and it's expected that we are moving the child right back. Or it may be more of a respite situation where foster parents are gone and child is with grandma for 2 months. Do we really want to move the child to school once and then have to move them back again in 2 months? So considering all those things, we always say there's not really one thing that's most important or least important. It's going to depend on the child, their age, their situation, just going through that checklist, hopefully in collaboration between the foster care worker, the school liaison, and foster parents, and making the best decision. And as much as we would love to say that that discussion is had and that everybody's on the same page at the end of that discussion to decide which school that child should go to, we know that's not always going to happen. And so this slide talks about the Michigan Revised School Code. And in 2009, it was revised to state, and Kathleen mentioned this already, that DHHS would have that final say where the student goes or where the student is enrolled. Again, only between the school district of origin and school district of resident, not a third school. If that selection results in a student transferring to another school, school records must be immediately transferred to the new school. And this also includes a new school not denying enrollment based on lack of paperwork or lack of records. Our students may not immediately have all of the things that most of your students are required to have to enroll. And so a school cannot deny a youth in foster care enrollment based on that.
So I mentioned earlier, this is Kathleen, I mentioned earlier that districts should have procedures around a dispute and maintaining the school or the school stability for the student if a dispute is initiated. The responsibilities during a dispute say that LEAs must ensure that children in care who need transportation to the school of origin receive that transportation in a cost-effective manner. And it says that the LEA must provide or arrange for the adequate and appropriate transportation to and from the school of origin while any disputes are being resolved. That does mean paying 100% of all of the additional costs. I would like to plug, however, even though this, comes straight from the legislation, that we do continue to encourage collaboration between the local child welfare agency, placing agency, and the local school districts, so that everyone is in the know, everyone is attempting to work toward the same goal of school stability for that student. If you were to need to initiate a dispute, it does get entered into the Grants Electronic Management System, or GEMS, and you must get to that through the MDE foster care webpage link. It is suggested that you have a Michigan Education Information, or a MICE ID. You can enter and initiate a dispute, but please note that there are limitations. If you want to look at this without actually initiating, you can go to the MDE foster care webpage at the link that's listed below. And under the transportation tab, if you haven't been to the MDE foster care webpage, I'll put this plug in now. We've done a little bit more organizing to try to make items a little bit more user-friendly, or more easily identifiable to users. If you have comments or suggestions, I'm always looking to have them. For school staff, that's where it should be entered.
And I was just going to mention before we move on, for anybody listening that is a foster care worker and not a school district liaison, but you're a child welfare worker instead, if you are initiating that dispute, you would send that to our office, and that's the education policy email box, and that would be MDHHS / education policy. And if you're a state worker, you'd be able to find that in the address book. So those would be coming to our office if that dispute's coming from a child welfare worker. We wanted to talk a little bit about the different roles that we have, both on the child welfare side and then on the school district side. And so this talks about our education planners. So our education planners are specialized DHHS staff that work specifically with youth, typically work specifically with youth age 14 and up with open foster care cases on education issues. So these are full-time staff that their whole job is working on education. They are not in every county, though. We currently have 18 planners that cover 48 counties. So just over half of our counties are covered right now by a education planner where that is their job. In counties that do not have an education planner, we have identified points of contact, or DHHS points of contact instead, so that there is somebody you can reach out to in those counties. But our education planners receive regular and ongoing detailed training, and then are expected to train their staff in their counties on federal and state education law and policy. So all the stuff we're learning today. Special education, we provide them with a lot of information, a lot of regular training on IEPs, surrogate parents, stuff like that, where they then can be good advocates and teach their staff in their counties how to be good advocates when it comes to special education. We talk a lot with them about best interest determinations and how to make those and how to have those conversations appropriately. Higher education preparation and resources, so they do a lot of financial aid applications, college tours, and getting youth transitioning from high school to either post-secondary or the workforce. Sorry, and in general, older youth resources. So because they predominantly work with that population, they work a lot with the older youth resources. And just to mention again, those points of contact, if you are not in a county that has a full-time education planner, you can go to the MDE ESSA site and find a link that goes to the POC, our points of contacts. It has their names and contact information. But foster care responsibility. So even if you have a foster care worker that's full-time doing education, it is still always going to fall on the foster care worker to have the full case responsibility. It's the foster care worker that's doing that case plan, that's doing the payment processing typically, that is reporting to the court. It is the caseworker that's doing all of that. The education planner and the point of contact can assist, provide technical assistance, in a lot of cases get you to the right person, get you in touch with the foster care worker if needed when there are issues, but it's the foster care worker's ultimate responsibility to report on all case progress to the court, and that does include education.
So as the state foster care point of contact for MDE, it is my job to make sure that we are providing professional development opportunities and technical assistance for LEA foster care liaisons and other personnel. Like I mentioned earlier, I'll be working with people auditing folks. Ann and I last year presented to court officials, judges, referees, family law folks. We hope to have an audience in front of secondary counselors this year. So we're trying to think of all of the folks that we haven't had a chance to interact with yet, to make sure that we are connecting with all of the people who need to know this information to better help our students who are experiencing care have success in school. Additionally, it is the job of the state to coordinate and collaborate with both or all state child welfare placing agencies, including tribes. And in Michigan, we currently have 12 federally recognized tribal agencies who have their own unique individual structures that also must be navigated. So we are expected to issue guidance around the implementation of the Title I Part A provisions to include transportation procedures, how transportation will be addressed across district, county, and state lines, and what should be included or not included in those local procedures. We also suggest information around what should be considered for best interest determination decisions. And we are continuing at the state level, both DHHS and myself from MDE, to make sure that all of the appropriate parties are included in that discussion and conversation, and make sure as much as possible that schools are at the table and have a chance to provide input, because they're going to have clearly a perspective that the caseworker and potential new foster family is not going to have for that student. It is also our job to facilitate data sharing with all of the state, tribe, and other folks who generate data. I have to put in the plug that must be consistent around FERPA and other federal and or state privacy laws, regulations, and policies. For example, emailing student level or student identifiable information violates FERPA. You can't do that. So we suggest encryption or talking with your tech folks within your local agencies or offices to ensure that you are able to communicate appropriate information that does not bump into any of those guidances. It is also the state's job and expectation when we receive federal money that then gets allocated to the local education agencies that we have to monitor to ensure that things are happening. And how MDE has approached that thus far has been to make sure that within the EEM or Educational Entity Master, a foster care liaison has been identified. I want to say that every time I send out my 890 some emails, I get roughly 200 that bounce back. It could be because someone has left a position and the district hasn't yet caught up to and put in new information. It's possible that one character is off within the actual email, because this is a system-to-system draw. It's not a human draw. It's one system speaking to the other, and so the information that is generated comes directly from the system. So our communication ability is hindered or helped by the quality of information that is on the other side. So I can't stress enough how important it is to just look at your information. If you haven't received something, or if you are wondering why, it's been a month or so, or 2 months, or whatever, or why you're still getting information and maybe shouldn't be. So check that EEM. You have directions in this presentation on how to get to it, your district or any other district if you need to. It is also expected that every LEA has a foster care transportation plan procedure uploaded into the GEMS system, and that memo started circulating and was sent as of May 2018. It was shared in every spring workshop that was held across the state. I believe there were about 60 of those, and we have sent out other information. So you may want to check. And I say that because we have about 200 districts right now who have either not submitted, who submitted blank documents, or who submitted documents but didn't identify their school district. So there is a drop-down menu within the GEMS system that it's really clear, but maybe not clear enough, because there are several, I'm going to say 50 districts who uploaded something somewhere, but it's not assigned to their district. So don't be surprised if you see a memo or an email, not a memo, but an email communication that says, hey, we see you started this, but we need you to finish submitting it or identify your school district. So those are the monitoring points that we have focused on for the first couple of years of this work. At the district level, it's expected that the foster care liaison ensures that kids who are in care are immediately enrolled in and regularly attending. We want you to know who your kids are, and I've got some updates that will hopefully help you know who your kids are so that you can make sure that they're there. It is the LEA responsibility to make sure that transportation procedures are in place. Please get them into GEMS or identify your school if that hasn't happened yet. There is a sample procedure document, transportation plan document it's in Word form. It's available on MDE's foster care webpage. You can customize that to your district. It is available. Those districts who have adopted Neola as your policy, it is completely acceptable, but that must also be uploaded into GEMS. It can't just be a board memo or a board minute somewhere that says, yes, we've adopted it. It has to be present in the GEMS system. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, the direct certification report was updated December 4th of 2018 to better reflect an accurate student count for local education agencies. I won't go into the details of what happened, but just know that students who are experiencing foster care and are identified within the direct certification report should not disappear from that report for the entire year. Once they're identified for the school year, they will remain in foster status for the remainder of that school year, even if they go out of care. So your direct cert report is going to say for that school year, according to the data, this child was in foster care. Please let me know if you have further questions. I can elaborate down the road. Other district responsibilities include participating with that best interest discussion whenever possible, whenever appropriate, and I would like to empower districts to ask for it. If it's happened, you weren't there, you want to be there, try to coordinate and collaborate with and connect with your child welfare workers or the point of contact or ed planner if you have one in your county, to make sure that if for some reason, based on the student situation and circumstances, if the school wasn't included, feel free to initiate that. Districts are expected to facilitate transferring records as soon as students are moved. And we did have a question come in around ensuring that districts are notified when students are leaving care and leaving the school. That has not, that we have just kind of come to realize that, oh, we're doing better. I won't say we're doing great, but we're doing better on notifying schools when kids are coming into care. We're not always doing so well when they're leaving care or moving schools. So that is a focus area for our training this year. We are asking, of course, that district liaison also share information with child welfare agency representatives, and consistent with FERPA, but there are legislative things in place that say districts can share this information, and they really need to share student achievement and student attendance and student level information with child welfare workers, and to work with the transportation cost agreements between the LEAs and the child welfare placing agencies. We'll talk more in detail about that here down the road. So the following is the suggested structure for reimbursing the additional costs. And I have a slide dedicated to the definition of additional costs to transport students, the students experiencing care to the school of origin if it is determined in their best interest. If a student's foster care placement is funded or eligible to receive Title IV-E funds, MDHHS will reimburse additional transportation costs at 100%. If a student's foster care placement is not being funded or is not eligible to be funded by Title IV-E, MDHHS is offering to reimburse additional costs up to 50% to help LEAs. We are encouraging continued collaboration. I do want to put a plug in that there are lots of states. More than half of the states across the nation do not help at all with any additional costs or any transportation costs if the placement is not Title IV-E. They do nothing. Ours has generously offered to pay up to 50% of additional costs. Again, collaboration should continue. Or if the LEA chooses, they may fund the entire amount. Child welfare workers do have 30 days to make Title IV-E eligibility determination and to notify LEAs. It probably will be less than 30 school days to make that determination, but we have to leave a little bit of a window because there are so many moving parts when that child first comes into care, especially if CPS has been involved, because we have two separate systems at that point. We have a CPS system, then we have foster care, and then we have potentially several school moves. So it may take a minute or up to 30 days for that eligibility to be determined. During the window of Title IV-E eligibility determination, LEAs are picking up that transportation with possible 100% or up to 50% reimbursement for additional costs from MDHHS. Child welfare workers are also responsible for notifying LEAs if the student's placement Title IV-E eligibility changes. So if they're in a non-Title IV-E placement and all of a sudden it becomes a licensed or eligible facility, then that changes the reimbursement structure. But it's their job to let districts know, and it's certainly okay for LEAs to be asking about that. It is allowable and permissible for LEAs to use Title I Part A funds to cover those non-reimbursed costs for additional transportation. That, if it is decided at the LEA level, must be identified in the Title I school selection application on screen 5. I think might be item 11. I'm not sure if that number changed for this year coming up. It has been suggested that districts who want to use Title I Part A money take a look at what you've allocated for your McKinney-Vento students, and if your foster student population runs similar or is similar to what the McKinney-Vento numbers are, it might be reasonable to think that you would maybe want to suggest that same amount, but that is a very local decision, and I will leave it there. Because there has been a lot of discussion around transportation reimbursement, we thought it would be helpful to include the federal definition of additional costs for transportation, and this comes directly word for word as a quote from the non-regulatory guidance, question number 27. There is a link to that as well in your handouts. There's also a link on the resource slide at the end of this presentation. I also have it available on the MDE foster care webpage. I encourage you to download it, have it in paper if you're a paper person like me, so you can color code and leave yourself notes. It's especially helpful when you're talking to other folks within your local education agency, like transportation directors, your superintendent, your Title I folks. But back to the definition. Additional costs incurred in providing transportation to the school of origin should reflect the difference between what an LEA would otherwise spend to transport a student, any other student, to his or her assigned school, and the cost of transporting a child in foster care to his or her school of origin. So whatever that average cost is to transport kids in your district is taken away from what you're spending, and what's left over is the difference, which is additional costs. And that is the amount that is eligible for either 100% reimbursement based on Title IV eligibility or up to 50% based on collaboration and non-Title IV eligibility. So please let me know if you have other questions around that. We can return to that. We do have a couple of other questions. Oops. Let's see. Updates. I mentioned that our direct certification report was updated as of December 4th, 2018. I am working now with CEPI and MDE and MDHHS to update it yet again so that there aren't big time gaps between when the report is pulled from DHHS, run through the CEPI filters, and then available for district use. So look forward, please, to another announcement around the direct certification. Please remember to check, if you are not the person who does this in GEMS, if there's a Title I person or your people accounting person or however your district has your structure set up, please, please, please make sure that your district has uploaded the foster care transportation plan in GEMS. It was due October 1st. We're not, sending out the GEMS police anytime soon. We're really trying to work with districts so that they understand that once that's there, unless you're asked to make changes or updates, it should be a one-time thing unless the law changes. So once it's there, unless you are notified via a monitoring notification that changes are necessary, consider it good to go. The Educational Entity Master, or EEM, please, please, please verify and check that information. We will be having several regional training opportunities coming up. Ann Rossi and myself will be traveling around the state, and I will be traveling around the state with spring workshops. So we will be sending out information. There's also the Special Populations Conference for 2019 that is scheduled for September 16th and 17th. We are expecting there to be an entire foster thread, so we're hoping for 6 to 7 sessions, and we've already got a great lineup for that, so we hope to see you there. As I mentioned earlier, there's an updated MDE foster care webpage. Please visit. And it's my intention to continue growing that area and breaking it down so that it's easier for you to find the resources that you need. And that we have formed a K-12 Action Network. And I would like to say that you will be receiving a couple of surveys. If you're a DHHS worker, you'll get a DHHS survey. If you're an LEA person, you'll get an LEA-specific survey. We are putting out questions to try to garner information around specific technical assistance needs and other toolkit ideas. We have a lot going on, but we want to make sure to stay in tune and in touch with each of you in the field. We do have our resource page. I apologize, it got a little scrunched up there. We'll try to fix that, but I think you can still read. The top one is that US Ed HHS Joint Foster Care non-regulatory guidance. That is the direct link. Download it to your desktop or download it and print it or do both. I've updated to include our partnering agencies, Fostering Success Michigan, the new foster care, Michigan's Children, and then our State of Michigan websites. We have michigan.gov MDE, MDHHS, and the DHHS page. So,
And that bottom one, the bottom link is actually our FOM policy. So often when I talk about, I always say 723, and I kind of ramp down people's throats. That is, it's about 22 pages, I believe, in our updated one that will be coming out. But that is for any foster care worker, they have to follow our FOM policy. And education just happens to be 723.
So we did have a couple of questions that came in during the presentation. One of them is, what is the time frame a school should expect an update on when when a child has been moved from the school due to a placement change? DHHS has identified a 5-day window, and Anne, please jump in, but there's a 5-day window to get the student in a seat. That is, however, different than CPS, right? Or am I wrong there? Is CPS separate?
No, they should be. If they're coming into foster care, the requirement is still to have it from placement. They should be enrolled and attending within the 5 days of initial placement or replacement.
Okay, I hope that answers that question. And if you would like to ask a more detailed question, I also wrote down for that person slide 5 should cover that. And the second question is, there has been a lot of training around when a 942, which is the DHHS form, not CPS form, that notifies a district that a student is coming into care or has moved placements. It is also functioning as a notification and record release. So that is the magic document that unlocks the ability for schools to talk to child welfare workers. So it has been our training, and I'll happily repeat that the initial point of contact for child welfare workers, DHHS workers, child welfare placing agencies should be with that district foster care liaison. That first point of contact should be with that person. We're still working on that. We know that.
And I just want to make sure, and I don't know, I think we were reading this question differently.
Okay.
Because to me, the question is that we should mention that the 942 should also be sent to POCs, which that would be DHHS staff. And so a foster care worker would also send it. And I will say, and I think I maybe hit on this a little further in the conversation after this question came in, that the point of contact is, unless they're an education planner, the point of contact on the DHHS side is just that. So they're not going to, if a foster care worker is sending out the 940, the 942 to the school, they're not also going to CC it to their DHHS point of contact. In most cases, because that point of contact isn't going to be involved in that. If it's an education planner, maybe, because the education planner may end up being more involved in a case if there's education issues. But a foster care worker may not automatically send it to their own POC. But if you were right, if the question was about liaisons, we have in our policy says it should be sent directly to the foster care district, the liaison who's identified in the EEM.
So I hope that answers the questions as they were intended. And if not, both of our Anne's, I'll just mention, has a new phone number. It is listed here
as of today.
As of today. So this is a brand new number. So if you have other presentations, please refer to this one as the most current. You can reach us either by email or phone. I always recommend email first because we're on the road a lot. Anne says her too. We do appreciate your time with us today. We do hope that you are able to join at some event in the future, and we encourage, if you do receive our survey questions, that you take a moment and help us better understand your needs so that we can begin addressing them as we build our this program, our programs together across time for the betterment of kids. Again, we thank you so much, and we hope that everyone has a wonderful day.
Here's Carrie.
I just wanted to mention too, don't forget that there is a whole ESSA toolkit on the FSM website. So if you go to www.fosteringsuccessmichigan.com and use the search bar, then you will be able to type in ESSA, ESSA, and an ESSA toolkit will come up, and it will include today's PowerPoint, a video recording of today's video or today's webinar, and then also all of the documents plus some additional resources from Anne and Kathleen. Thank you so much for joining us again. If you like this content and would like to see it continue, please consider a donation at www.fosteringsuccessmichigan.com. If you have ideas for upcoming webinars, please feel free to reach out, and have a great week.